Hello. Hello, everyone. Hello. I will introduce to you our last speaker for today. Thank you for being with us. And thank you, Professor Leo Heller, for being with us today. It's a great honor to have you here. Professor Leo Heller is a Brazilian researcher at the René Rechou Institute, Cruz, Minas, a regional unit of the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, a scientific institution for research and development in the biological sciences. He is the former UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation, known for his activism in social movements related to water and sanitation as human rights issues. He also has extensive experience in policymaking, teaching, and research in environmental policy and management, as well as environmental health related to water and sanitation. And in 2022, Professor Heller launched the book, The Human Rights to Water and Sanitation, published by the Cambridge University Press. So Professor Heller is a reference when we talk about the implementation of the human rights to water and sanitation, and I'm really looking forward to hear his presentation. Thank you again.
Good evening to all of you. Thank you, Luciana, for this a little bit exaggerated introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be here today and to talk to this topic. As you can see in the title of this presentation, I'll talk about Brazil, about water and sanitation services. And my issue here is to think on changes, institutional changes. I'm suggesting in the title that we have three periods, three moments, but it's more complicated than that. The first one is a state-centric logic. The second one was a neoliberal reform in 2020. And the third, we don't know. The third is the future, and I put a question mark in the title for us to discuss and to think on determinants and influences on that. So I'm happy to start with a map because the maps were populated several presentations today. Just to give you a glance on Brazil. Brazil is, of course, most of you know, is a big country. This is a population estimate for last year, for the last census, 207 million inhabitants. There are 5 macro regions, 27 states, 5,570 municipalities. It's a very unequal country. In general, very general, we can say that we have the most dynamic regions in the southeast and the south, and the poorest regions in the north and northeast. And the center west is a little bit in the middle of the strand. And this expresses also in water and sanitation indicators. We'll see some figures in the next slide. There are also several inequalities in the country when we look at water and sanitation, when we compare different levels of wealth, when we compare different levels of educational level, when we compare, for instance, urban and rural areas. And when we disaggregate data, we can see clearly that it's a very unequal country, and maybe water and sanitation is a very important symptom, a very important proxy of all the inequalities that Brazil faces. It's important to have a historical perspective on this discussion, and I put here in this graph this different federal governments. It's important to say that Brazil is also a federal structure with 3 levels, the national government, state governments, and municipal governments, such as the US, but different than the other countries in Latin America, for instance. And it's important to link the government at that each time with some marks related to water and sanitation policies. So we had around 20 years of military dictatorship between 1964 and 1985. Then we have two governments that were a little bit turbulent, but was a kind of transition from the dictatorship or the democracy. Then we have 8 years of government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso that was a kind. It's difficult to characterize each period because there are several nuances, but in short, was a kind of social democrat policy. I would say right-center orientation, with some social achievements, but a policy very much oriented to neoliberalism, privatization of several services and policies in the country. Then we have the Worker Party governments, 2 periods of Lula, 1.5 period of Dilma Rousseff, that was impeached, as some of you know. And then we had Temer, that was the vice president of Dilma in 2 years. Bolsonaro, it's better not to talk very much about that. The last 4 years, and now Lula that won the elections last year. In 1971, we had a plan, a national plan, Planasa, a national plan of saneamento, water and sanitation, that changed dramatically the structure of water and sanitation provision in the country. I'll talk in more details about that. And it was not a neoliberal policy, it was most state-centric policy, but with several nuances. In 2007, in the second Lula's term, there was a law that was adopted. The law established a new, maybe at the first time, a regulatory framework for this sector, for water sanitation. It was a very important law because it established several issues related to how to organize water and sanitation services in the country. And in 2020, in Bolsonaro's period, this law was changed. There was a reform on this law, very much oriented to a neoliberal perspective. I will explore all of this. So, based on that timeline, what I'll discuss in this presentation first was the landscape prior to Planasa, this plan from 1971. Then I will speak a little bit about Planasa and explain. It was very important because it changed very much, and it established a very consolidated model that is not so easy to change because of the restructuring of the sector at that time. Then I'll talk about the law, 11,044/5 of 2007. Then the law, the change of the law in 2020, and then speculate some future scenarios. But also, I think it's important to take these situations to think on. We are in an academic environment here, to think on research questions and research that can be established to understand better not only the past, but the future, how to monitor, how to think on the influences that establish all these changes in the political arena. So prior to Planasa, there were different experiences, different models, but it's important to highlight that there were experiences of private concessions. In the middle of the 19th century, it started to have private concession. I think it's a little bit small, the letters. Can you read? Yeah. It's interesting because there were a concession of sanitation in the public detention center in the prison in Rio de Janeiro. That was the first experience in the world of concession of services to a private company. And based on this experience, the concession was extended for all the cities we discussed that later this morning, early this morning, and the creation of the Rio de Janeiro City Improvements Company Limited in 1862. It was a very early system using what we call a combined system. It is a system that put together sewage and stormwater in the same network. Now there are different conceptions of the sewerage. And in other cities, capital cities and states, Porto Alegre in Rio Grande do Sul, Ceará, Recife, São Paulo had a very limited experience on private provision of water and sanitation, just in some parts of the state and the city. This is mainly water production, not water distribution. And in Belém, in Pará, and so on and so forth. Though this started in the middle of the 19th century and went until the middle of the 20th century. So it's not a short period. It's around 100 years of private concession in the country, but a little bit limited, not so spread in the country. And most of these experiences has stopped based on reactions, popular struggles against the unsatisfactory quality of the services. In general, the companies implemented services on the center of the cities and left behind all the peri-urban areas. So a small part of the population of most of these cities were served by the provider, and this led to reactions that at the end terminated in the cancelling of the concessions. The latest terminations were in Sanitation Company in Rio, 1947, and Water and Sanitation Services in Santos, in São Paulo. So this was a kind of experience in that period prior of Planasa, but in most of the municipalities, the services were provided by municipal providers. In some states, there were a state company that support the municipalities, but not all. Basically, these state companies didn't provide services, but mainly provide technical assistance for the municipal services. An important moment in this history prior to Planasa was the role of this federal foundation, SESP, Special Services for Public Health, that turned to a foundation in 1960, basically, that received money from the US, basically from the Rockefeller Foundation, and supported several medium-sized cities implementing municipal services and giving technical assistance and providing engineers and managers to organize a municipal system. This was very important, and important not only because of the extension of the action of CESP, but also for the new vision, the new conception, the modernization of the services, and bringing to Brazil some international experiences in terms of technology and management, etc. So this was really an important moment in that at that time. But in this period before the 70s, there were a very unorganized and I would say fragmented way in which the federal government operates this sector. In 1960s, early 1960s, 17 federal agencies had actions related to water and sanitation. That's too much, too difficult to coordinate, too fragmented, including how they operate across all this big territory and the several states, etc. Some operated in the Northeast. Sudene is some with this field of action. The NOx operate in the semi-arid region. National Department of Works against the arid seca drought. Yeah, Fundação CESP. This was a company, a federal company operating mostly in the capitals, etc., etc. Here is Amazon and several others. So this very unorganized structure in the federal government was one of the arguments to have a reform in the sector. So this was some of the elements of the political landscape at that time, in the early 70s, that create a space for the reform in 1971. A strong presence of the US cooperation that encouraged this reform and that gave at that time some funding for implementing services in some areas. And because it was a dictatorship, this was an act from the government. This is important. Canceling elections for governors, state governors, and also mayors of the capitals and of other cities, strategic cities as well. So the governors were appointed by the president and the mayors of the capital cities appointed by the governments after 1965 until 1984. In 1966 and 1967, the federal government started to improve the state companies for water and sanitation. That has a very limited role until that time. The federal government started to fund, it started to give technical assistance, managerial assistance, and started to, at the same time, to reduce the funding to the municipal services. So there are several elements in this context. One was the very rapid urbanization of the capitals, particularly the capitals, that led to evictions and other important social issues. And in short, what we had in the early 70s, before the implementation of PLANASA, in the political dimension, a severe restrictions on individual freedoms and on censorship of the press that create a freedom for the government to do what they want. Is different from now, that there is at least some public scrutiny of the public policies, not at that time. At economic dimension, we face an accelerated growth with inflow of foreign capital, but an accelerated increase in external debt and inflation as well. It was an outcome of this growth. And regarding the cities, a very big migration from the rural areas for the cities, the capitals in particular, that was combined with this strategy of economic growth and legitimization of the new regime. So this creates an environment for this reform in 1971 that changed several elements of the water and sanitation policy. One element was the strengthening of the state companies. The state companies started to operate the systems, different than the period before, where the municipal services were in charge of operating and providing services. For this to happen, it was necessary to have concession contracts between municipalities and the state level, and there are several legislative changes to allow for these concession contracts. So the municipality would need to allow the state company to provide services during a certain period, in general 30 years in its territory. This was done with an authoritarian process. The fact that the mayors of the capitals were not elected was an element that facilitated this process. So the mayors signed the contracts without any reaction, any restriction for that. And in the legal field, as I said, the concession contracts were allowed through alterations in the legislation. And in the financial field, this was important. A new source of funding was identified through a fund. FGTS is a fund made up of workers' money. The companies that has a worker as an employer send money periodically, monthly, to this fund. This fund is owned by the worker, but the worker can't have this money immediately, only when he retires. And then this fund, at that time of a very huge economic growth, was very important and allowed to fund the implementation of several water and sanitation services by the state companies. Only the state companies were allowed to have funds from have money from this fund. So this was an important arrangement in terms of funding, because funding was very scarce before this national plan. And the logic of using this fund for the companies was through a logic of full cost recovery. So the tariffs needed to be adapted in order to face the payment of the funding from this national fund. And also, these are two very important dimensions in terms of economic field. One is the cost recovery. So tariffs would need to be increased. The second was the cross-subsidy. This is an interesting issue because as the state company provides services for several municipalities, for instance, in my state, Minas Gerais, the state company provides services for 700 municipalities. And the tariff is the same. There is a unified tariff. So there is a cross-subsidy between those municipalities that have more superavit of receipts, and two in the direction of the others that have deficits. In general, larger cities in Brazil has more economic sustainability, and small cities less economic sustainability. So there is this cross-subsidies between them. This is a little bit the picture of what happened between the 60s and the 2000s. We have here in blue what happened with the coverage of water services, and you can see clearly that was a good progress from around 40% of the total population, urban population, and around 82, 83 at the end of the period, but not the same regarding sanitation. This is mainly sewage connection to the network, around 34 to 52. So sanitation is a very big gap in the country. Sanitation is a very big challenge in terms of including universalizing the provision. Well, several big works were built in the countries, particularly in the capitals. Here we have 3 water treatment plants in Belo Horizonte, in São Paulo, capital, and in Rio. But at the same time, the cities were growing fastly, and favelas were increasing and growing and disseminating a lot without proper services. It was a very big challenge for the state companies to provide services there. This is very impressive, and I think this is the most important increase in the urban population worldwide. In 20 years, the population in the cities in Brazil grew from 31 million to 80 million, from 1960 to 1980. So 45 of the population in the beginning of the period to 69 of the population in the end of the period. So this was a challenge for the water companies to provide services to the cities with the growing of the favelas and villas and other informal settlements there. So this is a cartoon in synthesizing that. In the late 80s, this person is asking for water, and the well will say, no, we don't have water here. And here in the early 80s, a lot of works and increase in the access. But problems remain. One is the environmental agenda. There is very limited wastewater treatment in the country. It's increasing, but it's still limited. And also proper sanitation services upstream on the wastewater treatment. So the environmental agenda was very behind the priority of the state companies during this period. So moving to the next period, we had this law, 11,044-5 in 2007 in the Lula's government. That was very, very important law because it regulated the sector and established clear rules for service provision, service delegation, and also in the conceptual side of the regulation, it was an advanced law. In Brazil, it's very common to use the expression saneamento básico, basic sanitation, saneamento básico, that is broader than water and sanitation. It encompasses 4 components: water, sanitation, urban solid waste, and urban rainwater or stormwater management. And so the law encompasses all these 4 components. There is in the law a suggestion that environmental health is a priority in providing services and not approaching and addressing water and sanitation as an economic good. The role of the state was strengthened in the law, and the public meaning of basic sanitation was also reaffirmed, as opposed of the concept of privatization. It's not a law that looks at the privatization of the services, although it doesn't prohibit it. After the law, there were some experiences of transferring services from the public to the private sector. But it's not oriented to this type of management model. There are important definitions and commitments to universalization, integrality meaning not only implementing the 4 components together, but also to implement these components in an integrated way with health, with urban development, with the environmental policy, and also equity as a value. This is very important. Regulation of services by agencies was an issue included in the law and a condition for the service delegation, for instance. Planning was a very central pillar of the law, and also evaluation of services in an articulated way. This was also very important in the law, clear rules for the delegation of services, and so different from the Planaza period when a municipality intends to transfer a service or delegate a service to a state company or even a private company. The rules of this delegation was very clear. Just to give you an example, in my city, Belo Horizonte, has today 2.5 million inhabitants, and signed that contract with the state company in 1973. The contract has 2 pages. In the contract, only the rights of the provider are included, and not the rights of the roader of the services are included. So this should be the opposite, because the municipality is contracting a company to provide services. And now with the law, there are clearer rules to do that. Social participation is something included in the law, although not so effective. And population living in poverty was very clearly included in the law as a priority for service provision. So this is a very quick, brief synthesis of the law, but just to say that it was a very important moment. A law is not enough, as we know, to change the institutional landscape, but it's important. It's necessary but not sufficient, as we know, but at least it was a first step in terms of trying to change the landscape and to reduce, for instance, the inequality in the access to services. We can identify some outcomes of this law. One was the creation of regulatory bodies. This is a graph showing how from 2009 to 2019, in 10 years, the number of agencies regulating services increased in a significant way, which is important. The same, regulation is not sufficient, but it's an important step to make the provider more attached to the rules, to the contracts, to goals in the service provision. There are more municipal plans. The municipal plan is something that is a necessary condition to sign a contract by a municipality and another level of provider. And we had several municipalities preparing their plans, implementing the plans, although we need to recognize not all the plans have good quality. And an important issue that started in Lula's government was the participatory process. One example is the realization of the national conferences of the cities, but also in some states and some municipalities run these conferences that in principle are the main instance for deliberation in the sector of urban development. And water and sanitation is part of this discussion. It's a very participatory process with different stakeholders being part of this process. The conferences were promoted each 3 years, and they stopped in the Bolsonaro's government. Lula is promising to restart them. But also, it's important to highlight the formation of the National Council of the Cities that includes also water and sanitation, and some states and some municipalities also created a council of the cities where there are representatives of the government, but also the civil society, and with periodical discussions. I don't need to say that Bolsonaro also eliminated the National Council of the Cities and several other councils. So participation in the period of Bolsonaro was not so sexy as before and as now, I think, I hope. So then we come to this reform in 2020 in government Bolsonaro that was clearly a reform intending to increase dramatically the presence of the private sector in the sector, replacing the public provision by the private provision. I need to say, I saw that there was a question in a previous session about And what is the best, the private or the public? I need to say that I have a departure that there are risks. I'll show that for the human rights to water and sanitation. This is my field. When there is a delegation to the private sector to run as services, at least in my environment in Brazil, in Latin America, I consider myself not only an academic but also an activist in different groups, and we have several discussions regarding those risks. So I'm here showing this change, this institutional change, as something not necessarily good for the water and sanitation services, particularly in providing services for small cities, rural areas, peri-urban areas in the cities, if we think on the priority of the private providers. One of the mechanisms used in this law to facilitate the private provision of the services was to close the doors for state companies to operate in a municipality. Before this law, a state company could sign a contract with a municipal government without a bidding. And after the law, necessarily any delegation of the services by the municipality need to be through prior bidding. And in this bidding, the state company can participate, but what we are seeing so far is a strong presence of the private company. No state companies won bidding so far. So this is a very efficient mechanism to put on the side the state companies. And the privatization in this law was conceived through a process of regionalization. So each state needs to create a region at a sub-national or sub-state level, and the bidding would be for each region in the state. Just to give you an example, Rio de Janeiro formed 4 regions. It was a very curious arrangement because the state was divided in 4 regions, but also the city of Rio de Janeiro divided in 4 regions. Each region of the city belongs to a state region, and there were 4 biddings for each region, and now all the state of Rio, except some specific municipalities, small municipalities, have a private provider with a contract of 35 years, and very, very hard to change and to cancel those contracts because there are several indemnization clauses there. But this is what was argued to promote this model by the law in 2020, and I need to say that this discourse, this narrative, was very, very intense in the country and disseminated by the media, disseminated by several intellectuals, stakeholders, economists, etc., was a kind of hegemonic rationality. And the rationality was we have deficits in access to water and sanitation. The country faces a fiscal deficit, so there is no public money, public resources to face this deficit. So the only solution is to bring the private sector with this investment, their investments, to solve the problems. This is a very problematic rationality because when you look at the deficits, actually there is a huge deficit. There are several ways to estimate these deficits. This is one way. This is from the National Plan for Water and Sanitation that shows in 2017 around 40% of the total population of Brazil without an adequate water supply, around 45% of the population without an adequate sanitation service. But what we need to think is that this deficit is not homogeneously distributed across the country and across the population. As I said before, there is a huge inequality, and this deficit is very well identified and is located particularly in rural areas, peri-urban areas, small cities, and so on and so forth. This is only, if we disaggregate the data, we can see clearly these inequalities. This is only one example. This is a study that we have done to the Pan American Health Organization, thinking on, this is an interesting way to address these inequalities, thinking on different layers of inequalities, intersectionality, if you want. And when we compare a population that, the slides, as you see, have several languages. This is only for you to be more familiar with, this is Spanish. When we compare someone that is live in an urban area, is white, and live in a household where the person has a superior educational level, with someone that is rural, black, and with incomplete primary level, the difference in the access to sanitation in Brazil was 76 percentage points. So the first group had around 93% of access, and the second group around 16% of access. This shows clearly how unjust is the access to services, not only in Brazil. As you can see, we have here figures for other countries. El Salvador is in a worse position than Brazil, but also other countries that we have had access to data. So this is to show that what is necessary in the country in the field of water sanitation is to provide services to this population that belongs to groups such as the second group here. So the question is, would the private companies be interested in extend the services to these populations? The issue of the fiscal deficits is also a kind of sophism, because, of course, the country is not rich, there is not superavits to everything, but this is a question of selection and to choose what to do and in what to invest. This is only two figures from two periods of investments in water and sanitation, periods that were not so different in terms of economic development, and we can see that when there is a priority, the funding, the budget can be much more important. This is a billion of reais. And this was the president of a public bank in Brazil saying that resources, funding for sanitation, water and sanitation is available. But is available only for the private companies, not for the public companies. This was an intentional policy to not to fund the public companies and to orient the available resources to the private companies. And the other sophism is in which extent the private companies will bring new money to the sector. This is something a little bit old, but very important. 2006, La Jornada, a newspaper from Mexico, because in Mexico, the World Water Forum was realized in 2006, and the vice president of water of the World Bank said basically that we believed that in the 90s, the private companies will bring new money to the water and sanitation sector. This is important because it's the World Bank saying, the World Bank that was the main promoter of privatization across the world. And she said that 90% of the funding follow from the public budget, not from the private budget. So we need the public. We don't trust anymore that the private companies will fund. And there are several researchers showing that the main sources of funding of private companies are first tariffs that are collected from the users, and second, public banks that funds with usually very low rates the private companies. This is another thing that is important. Maybe some of you know this publication. This publication identifies processes of remunicipalization of services across the world. And I'm very convinced that the main trend nowadays is not to privatize services, but in the contrary, to remunicipalize, to cancel concessions. This is taking place in several parts of Europe, at the US, in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. We saw the water war in Bolivia before. And these are some figures. More than 200 cases of water municipalization in 37 countries, affecting over 100 million people between 2000 and 2015, and the majority of cases in France and the US, but also across the several regions. There was a trend of remunicipalization. Atlanta here, Paris, Berlin, Jakarta, La Paz, Cochabamba, Buenos Aires are some examples of, and symbolic examples of remunicipalization for several reasons. But the main reason is that the private provision was not satisfactory in these places. This is, I'll go quickly here, but this is a theoretical model to assess in which extent privatization can affect or can put in risk the human rights to water and sanitation. I'm using, and my group is using this in some researches. And there are three elements that putting together promotes those risks to human rights. One is that usually the private company not only make profit, but try to maximize those profits. And to maximize profits, it's necessary to raise tariffs, for instance, or to diminish investments. The provision of water and sanitation is a natural monopoly. This is an economic concept, but it's important to think on that, because it's very hard to regulate the natural monopoly when you don't have competition in the provision of the services, and also clearly power asymmetries. For instance, in Brazil, the recent concessions are for very big companies with international shareholders that dialogue with sometimes very weak public authorities with very weak resources to argue, to think on not to increase tariffs, for instance. So, future scenarios. This is more figures on the access to water. This is water in Brazil, and we can see here, you will not see very well, but I can trust in me, there are several types of providers. There is a landscape of very fragmented organization of the sector. This for water, this for sanitation. So there are some private companies, state companies, municipal companies, inter-municipal companies. And what is more concerned is about the inequalities. We can see in sanitation more clear that, not here, here. For instance, in the southeast, 85% of the population have access to the services. In the northeast, 39, in the north, 18. So we are comparing 85 with 18 with 39. In the south is not that good, 55, but better than the other regions. So this is only a phase of the inequalities that the privatization will need to address. And there is a debate among different actors, different stakeholders. There are some groups that are supporting strongly to keep, I'm talking about today and nowadays, to keep the reform of 2020, and there are others that are criticizing and asking for change of the framework. So this is invading the Lula's government and the Lula's ministers. We need to take a decision on what is the direction we will go. And Lula took the power in 1st of January of this year, so less than 2 months in the government, and we don't know yet what will be the direction of the Lula governments. And there are some question marks here. The political environment of Lula government is an environment with different pressures. It was a coalition of different parties with different political orientations. It's not a PT, worker party's government only. There are constraints, there are contradictions. So this coalition pushed Lula to appoint some ministers from a different political orientation from on him. In one case is the Minister of the Cities, the Minister of the Cities, that is very conservative, and water sanitation will be under the Minister of the Cities. And very different, for instance, when we compare with the Minister of Health, of the Minister of the Environment, and others. But on the other side, the main commitments of Lula during his campaign and the first statements in the government is that my priorities are ending inequalities and combating poverty. So how to reconcile these trends? The other issue is that there are different pressures from state governments, unions, and civil society organizations for not to privatize and to keep the prevalence of public provision. But on the other side, as I said, orthodox economists and actors aligned with the market are pressuring to the other direction. So this is a very complicated landscape. And another issue, very important, is that some of the decisions to where to go are not under the federal government, but is under the state and municipal governments. And some states have privatized it, for instance, Rio, Alagoas, and others are in process of privatization, such as Ceará, Pará, and others. But on the other side, there is a bill for amendment of the Constitution recognizing the human right to water. The question is that this will make a difference or not. What is the influence, the impact of these amendments? So basically, we have three scenarios. The first scenario is more inertial, a slow pace of service transferring to the private sector. So the privatization will go on, but in a more moderated pace, rhythm. The second scenario is to accelerate the neoliberalization of the sector with the prevalence of the neoliberal view in all instances. And the scenario 3 can be a reversal of trends. A slow reversal, I need to admit, because it will be very complex to cancel all the process and to go back to the previous elements. This is only to highlight. I published with two colleagues a paper some years ago arguing that there's a pendulum of private public before this change. So let's see how the pendulum will swing in the next years. So to conclude, this is the last slide. there are some research questions that I think is interesting to understand, not only Brazil, but to understand this very complex sector of water and sanitation, the managed models, and how the different influences goes to the decisions in the sector. One, certainly, is to follow up this process that is unique, I would say, in the contemporary world. I would say that Brazil maybe is the only country that is going to this massive privatization of the water and sanitation sector, and to see how the framework of the human rights can help to understand the impacts of this process. Just under advertisement of the book I published recently by Cambridge. And I think that it's very intriguing in terms of academic reflection to see the dependence of this historical process. As you know, the public policy and the public political science use this path dependence theory to understand in which extent the past decisions can constrain or can put a price in changes in the future. So how this state-centric tradition is a constraint for a neoliberal legacy, and the other way around, how the changes in 2020 will constrain to turn back to the public provision in the future. So there are some works using this path dependence framework, but I think it can be a powerful framework to understand the future development of these processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo, for that comprehensive view of water services in Brazil. I have one quick question, and then I'll open up for maybe one or two questions from the audience. I'm thinking about the hybrid system that is operating in La Habana, which is a combination of private and public. Are there other examples like that, and do you think that's feasible in Brazil politically, socially? Are there any benefits to a system like that? We tend to think about this as too binary, right? But there's something in between there. And in this case of La Habana, right, the state owns the majority of the stocks of the company, right? And it's Spain and I was at La Habana and I was at Barcelona, right? So. What's your experience with that kind of system? And
yeah, no, thank you for the question, because I used the word privatization as you said, as a kind of binary concept. And privatization is much more complex than that. And there are some papers that shows the different types of privatization. So you have a range of models of privatization. In one stream, you can identify the English, the United Kingdom model, that is called the full divestiture, where the private companies own the assets of the services. So the public has nothing with the services anymore. This is the same in Chile. So UK and Chile are two examples of this extreme. And then you have several shades of gray, I would say. The privatization with a concession, with a defined period, 3 decades, 4 decades, for instance. BOT, that is the company, BOT is to build, operate, and transfer. So the company build, operate for a certain time, 5 years, and then transfer back to the public services. There are the so-called PPPs, public-private partnerships. Maybe Havana is a case of PPP. And there are some experiences in Brazil, but PPPs for a small part of the system. For instance, in Salvador, I think you are from Salvador, there were a PPP to a private company to build and operate a submarine pipeline to discharge sewage in the ocean. is just a small part of the system. I don't know very well the Havana arrangement, but I think it's a kind of PPP, and can work. Can work with when the public authority has a good control and capacity of regulate the private company.
Any questions from the audience?
Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask you what kind of regulation there will be on the private companies, for example, disposing of sewage. You just mentioned sending the sewage out to the ocean. We heard earlier about the problem in Tijuana where raw sewage is contaminating San Diego. I believe it's illegal in the United States to discharge sewage into the ocean without treatment. And by the same token, what kind of regulation will be placed on the quality of water delivered, how clean it will be delivered by the private companies to the people who get the water?
Yeah, there is a good normatization of that in Brazil. There is an environmental law that prohibits the discharge wastewater without treatment, and there is also a regulation of drinking water quality from the Ministry of Health. Though this is an issue. The other issue is how to ensure that the companies will comply with that. And the model is that when there is a contract between the holder of the system and the company, private or public, the contract should establish goals in terms of when and in which extension wastewater will be treated, the water quality will comply with the standards. And the role of the regulatory agencies is to make the contract real, to make the companies comply with the contract. So the ideal world is that, but I'm not saying that it's working well everywhere. I think one problem is what I showed, the issue of the natural monopoly. Is very hard for the regulatory body to ensure that the company will comply with the contract. What to do if they don't do that? I'll talk about it very briefly. I followed a little bit what happened in Buenos Aires, for instance. The company started to be not complying the contract regarding water quality. There were cases of nitrate in water and also pollution of Plata, Rio da Plata, in Buenos Aires. And what the regulatory body could do to apply fines to the company. We are not complying with the contract, so we need to pay fines. And what the company said, well, I'm not complying with the contract because I don't have money to do that. If I need to pay the fines, I would have less money. So don't fine me. So this is a tension, natural tension when there is a natural monopoly. The regulator can say, okay, you are not complying with the contract, so I will cancel your contract. And we need to replace you by other companies. It's not easy to replace. It's not easy to come back to the public management. So this is a challenge in the water sanitation sector.
Okay, I'm worried about the time, 6:10 already, so let's give Leo our thanks. And remember, tomorrow we'll be reconvening here at 9 a.m. We have a series of panels. We have another keynote. And then we have a closing ceremony with music and some dance. Have a good night. Thank you for being here. Thank you.